Today on the program, the following three stories about the Israel-Hamas war. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the situation in Gaza is growing desperate and that the number of civilians killed and injured is totally unacceptable. We look at how the war is stoking tensions in France and the United States between Jewish and Palestinian communities. And a detailed look at the military role the United States is playing in the conflict. But first, a long and difficult war. That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's warning over the weekend as he declared a new stage in operations against Hamas. Israel has conducted a series of ground incursions into Gaza. Israel's military has released video purporting to show tanks, infantry and artillery operating inside the Palestinian territory. The military says it struck more than 450 terror targets in the raids, with Hamas also reporting heavy fighting with Israeli troops in northern Gaza. According to the Israeli Defense Forces, it's only the beginning.
Overnight, we increased the entry of IDF forces into Gaza to join the forces already there. We're gradually expanding the ground activities and the extent of our forces.
So the IDF signaling gradually expanding ground activities as opposed to an all-out ground invasion. Here's military analyst Mike Martin with more on Israel's strategy and goals.
It's quite a difficult thing to do, to move into an urban area and to try and, Israel said they want to destroy Hamas. That's a very difficult thing to do. And so what we've seen so far is Israel's crossed into the Gaza Strip, hasn't gone into the urban area, but is securing some areas outside of Gaza City itself. These sorts of wars, unconventional wars, always end with a political settlement. So they can't be solved militarily. And so the question for Israel is, OK, it's going to go in there. It will take out some Hamas tunnels. It will kill some of the leadership, very unlikely to destroy Hamas. And then what? They've then still got the same problem that they started with, but there will be tens of thousands of Palestinians dead and probably thousands of Israelis as well. And so the question is, what is the political strategy that wraps around this military activity? At the moment, I see none.
But the military still continue to urge civilians in Gaza to head south for their own safety. This, even as the UN is warning of a breakdown of public order amid widespread shortages of water, fuel and medicine. Over the weekend, thousands of Gazans broke into UN warehouses grabbing flour and other supplies. Aid deliveries have slowed to a trickle since Israel began bombing Gaza after the Hamas terrorist attack on the 7th of October. UN Chief Antonio Guterres is once again sounding the alarm.
The situation in Gaza is growing more desperate by the hour. I regret that instead of a critically needed humanitarian pause supported by the international community, Israel has intensified its military operations. The number of civilians who have been killed and injured is totally unacceptable.
And for a clearer picture of the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza, my colleague Terry Martin spoke to Toby, a spokesperson for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF.
Yeah, that's right. UNICEF has a team on the ground in the Gaza Strip. We lost communication for around 24 hours, but thankfully yesterday we were in touch again with the staff. What they're saying is the situation is really horrific. We have a member called Nesma who has a 4-year-old, 7-year-old girl. She was telling us about how petrified they are. Her 4-year-old has been resorting to sort of self-harm, pulling her hair, scratching her thighs because she's in such fear and the trauma's affected her so much. But at the same time, they're struggling to get access to the essentials for life. So safe water, they've been drinking salty water now for around 10 days. And her children have been saying, why can't I have clean water, safe water again, regular water? So the situation is horrific for every child inside the Gaza Strip right now.
There's a lot of concern, Toby, about what's happening in Gaza City, particularly at the Shifa and Al-Quds hospitals. What can you tell us about the situation there?
Yeah, well, I think the hospitals have been under massive strain. I mean, even before this escalation, the resources that hospitals had were limited in terms of medical supplies, in terms of fuel. And now with this escalation, the situation is really horrific. First of all, they're treating people who are wounded, children who are wounded in attacks, but they're also treating people, particularly children, in newborns, in incubators, and others for diseases and regular issues that happen all the time. And now we're extremely concerned from what we hear about the situation. Under the international humanitarian law, let's not forget that healthcare facilities are protected, and that's absolutely critical at this time, as the World Health Organization and others said. Moving anyone from any hospital is essentially a death sentence.
A UN General Assembly resolution has called for an immediate ceasefire. That's among growing demands for a humanitarian pause in the fighting. Do you believe that we will see the opening of humanitarian corridors anytime soon?
Well, we very much hope so, that we'll see increased humanitarian access, safe, unimpeded access that is not just one-off deliveries, but is sustained. We really need to scale up the amount of life-saving supplies that can come in. Some have come in, but it's certainly by no means enough given the immense needs that are inside the Gaza Strip. And that's why UNICEF, that's why the UN Secretary General keep calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, so that humanitarians can safely move supplies around. First of all, get them in and then move them around to reach people who are in such need at this time.
The focus of your organization, of course, is children. You described to us an anecdote from one of your employees on the ground there. How are children in general being affected by this war? Because I understand the number of casualties among children is very high.
Yeah, the number of casualties is horrific. More than 3,300 children have reportedly been killed. Another more than 6,300 children have reportedly been injured. These numbers are immense and horrific. So first of all, what people are trying to do is protect the lives of their children. The staff member I spoke about, Nesma, she's been, her first priority is to protect her children's lives, understandably, of course. But she's also trying to do a humanitarian job, to support other children, to support other families who are also having massive needs. So the situation is really horrific. And then there's the access to services, to health services, to essential service, to that safe water that we spoke about. It's so critical to keep children alive, and that's where we're at. It's really about life-saving work.
The impact of the conflict between Israel and Hamas is extending beyond regional borders. Here in Europe, for instance, the war has polarized opinion both for Israel and for Palestine. France, which has some of the largest Muslim and Jewish populations in Western Europe, has seen opposing demonstrations and also reported a rise in anti-Semitic incidents. Amidst this turmoil, one interfaith group is hoping to be an example of tolerance.
A haven of peace amidst a world in turmoil. This group, called United Believers for Peace, was set up 20 years ago. It aims to show that people from different religions can live in harmony, even in times of crisis. Their method is to work together on a common project, this garden.
It's great to have this place where we can all meet up. Muslims, Jews, Protestants, Catholics, to work together and exchange views.
We gather here to show that human life still has great value, even if it's put at risk elsewhere in the world.
This just goes to show that you can get along, even if you don't agree on everything.
When it comes to the current conflict in the Middle East, though, they prefer to keep their views private for now. They feel times are tense, especially in a country home to what are among the largest Jewish and Muslim populations in Western Europe.
The atmosphere is emotionally charged. People have a tendency in times of crisis to take sides. That can divide us. Instead of being soaked up by our beliefs and only talking to people who agree with us, we should try to establish a connection with other people. This garden helps. It's like another planet where we can forget about all the wars out there.
But not all parts of France are so calm. There have been numerous demonstrations in favour of Israel and pro-Palestinian gatherings over the past weeks. The government says that almost 600 anti-Semitic acts have been registered in France since the current conflict broke out. This researcher says it's not the first time unrest there has led to tensions here.
During the Second Intifada between 2000 and 2006, the number of anti-Semitic acts went up considerably, and Muslims in France were also reporting that they were being discriminated against. We don't know yet if the recent stabbing death of a teacher in what is believed to be an Islamic terrorist attack was linked to the war in Israel. But this event reinforces distrust towards all Muslims, even if they are in no way linked to this.
Back in Beauvais, the group plans to organise discussions on the war in the Middle East soon. This afternoon, though, they end their meeting with a message of hope from American Baptist minister and political activist Martin Luther King.
And the lion and the lamb shall lie down together, and every man shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid.
We try to be mindful and respectful towards others and accept our difference.
They believe faith should foster peace, a message they hope will resonate beyond Beauvais and France.
An ocean apart in the United States, Jewish and Palestinian American communities are on edge. Experts are warning of a rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Demonstrations on both sides of the conflict have broken out across the country, especially on college campuses. DW's Ines Paul has spoken to Jewish and Palestinian Americans in the capital, Washington, D.C.
Nolan Drazin has never been this worried walking around campus at Georgetown University. Over the past couple of weeks, he's seen protests which launched into hateful tirades.
It's extremely unsettling to see the calls for one state with no Jews in it, to see them walk right by and right in front of Jews on campus. It takes a toll, but you have to show up and you have to do what you have to do, otherwise they win.
What Noland has done is co-found Georgetown Law Zionists with fellow Jewish students. The group wants to take a stand against what they describe as growing anti-Semitic and anti-Israel rhetoric in the US.
This gentleman.
Fear is mounting among the Palestinian American community too. In Chicago, this little boy was killed in an alleged hate crime. Authorities said 6-year-old Wadia al-Fayoumi was attacked for being Muslim, and that tensions over the conflict in the Middle East led to the killing. Abir Ramadan Shinawi works as an educational consultant in the Palestinian American community. She would only talk to us in a park as she fears her office may become a target.
The 6-year-old boy who was murdered in the Chicago area from my hometown has caused a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear in parents who are making sure that their kids are being safe as well. My daughter, she texts me from work and she's like, "Mom, I feel anxious. I don't know why." And we talked about it, and it was about everything that was going on. And she said she feels paranoid about going out.
Tensions in the US are so high that President Joe Biden has spoken out to address the issue.
We must, without equivocation, denounce anti-Semitism. We must also, without equivocation, denounce Islamophobia. And to all you hurting, those of you hurting, I want you to know I see you. You belong.
Amid growing divisions, some groups are aiming to foster dialogue between Jews and Arabs. This rally was organized by Jewish Voice for Peace, a group that's critical of Israeli policy.
And I need to say something, I need to do something. We've been the victims of genocide before, and I can't sit by and watch my people now do that to others. So hoping to be here and hoping collectively we can send a powerful message.
As a Jew, it's important to me that my grief not be weaponized in this moment.
It's a beautiful thing that there are so many Jews, because I think it's a very appropriate representation of what it's like back home for people like us as well. It's not really about the religion at the end of the day. It's about humanity. It doesn't matter what you believe in, it doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter where you're from.
And let's get more on this story from DW reporter Wliiam Glucroft. Wliiam, just based on what we saw in Ines's report there, talk to us a bit about what relations between Jewish and Palestinian communities have traditionally been like in the United States, and if the Hamas terror attacks have changed that in any significant way.
I think what we heard from Enos's report there is a very good understanding that these groups, like all groups, are not monoliths, right? You have a variety of political opinions, you have a variety of demographics that are informing those opinions. And we hear that, you have in all groups, you have ethno-nationalists who are happy to lean into these kinds of fears and hatred and anger towards other groups. And then you also have seen, especially in the last recent weeks, groups calling for peace, groups calling for coexistence, groups calling for the end of war, groups looking to sympathize with the other. I think if there are two broad things that Jews and Palestinians in the United States specifically do have in common, it's one, they're both diasporic groups, right? They're both groups that are largely in a diaspora. The Palestinians, of course, stemming from the 1948 founding of Israel and the displacement that happened as a result, and Jews going back, basically the entire history of the Jewish people. You can look at the Inquisition, you can look at, of course, in more modern times, the Holocaust, pushing and spreading and forcing people all around the world. And that means that in addition to the geopolitical and geostrategic importance of the region when things like this in Israel and with the Palestinians happen, you also have very personal connection to this region due to the diasporic situation. And that causes, as we've seen in this report, anger, fear, worries to run very, very hot. Nonetheless, what we saw on October 7th isn't anything particularly new in terms of relations. But when these things happen, when these awful incidences of violence, of terrorism, of war happen, what we see is, of course, these sorts of issues coming more to the fore. They're always there, but in these moments of crisis, they're just that much more present.
And you also have President Biden having said that the U.S. stands with Israel in addition to sending military support to Israel. How are Palestinian and the wider Arab communities in the U.S. interpreting that support?
The U.S. is always in a tricky situation when it comes to Israel in particular, right? On one hand, the U.S. has ironclad commitment to Israel to defend the state of Israel, to defend the existence of Israel, and to its defense, right, against the many threats that Israel faces and has faced over the years. But at the same time, of course, the Arab world cannot be ignored. The other side of things cannot be ignored. The United States has security interests, it has economic interests in parts of the world that see things very differently. And so you do have this very difficult balancing act that the United States, over successive governments, right, regardless of who's president, regardless of what party is in power, to show its commitment to Israel while at the same time at least trying to appear what they like to call themselves as a neutral broker. Of course, that's questionable if the United States really can be a neutral broker when you're such a large and influential superpower in the world and you have your own interests that you are trying to protect. But nonetheless, we've seen this since the attacks with the U.S., while giving Israel quite a bit of latitude to defend itself in the way it sees fit, at the same time reining it in by reminding it of its commitments to international law. And actually, as we've been hearing from reports, a lot of collaboration and communication between Israeli and the United States military establishments to sort of shape and guide exactly how Israel's military response in Gaza is going to go. So we see the United States trying to walk that fine line, and also, for example, with the hostages, working with Qatar, for example, to try to get some of at least the American hostages out. This is the delicate political balance that the U.S. always faces in these kinds of moments.
And it's particularly that military role that I'd like to discuss with you further, Wliiam, if you'd just like to stay on the line, because we just need to first look at what the U.S. has recently said on this particular aspect, because speaking to the program 60 Minutes on U.S. news outlet CBS, Vice President Kamala Harris said, and I quote, "We have absolutely no intention, nor do we have any plans to send combat troops into Israel or Gaza, period." Wliiam, you also look at security issues for DW. Just talk to us a bit about what the United States sees as its military role in the current conflict.
Right, I think that quote from Kamala Harris, combat troops, is the important term there. The U.S., of course, has a presence in many parts of the world. It just depends how you define presence, right? Maybe not in a combat role, but certainly in training, in support for its many weapon systems it sells. And you see that in Israel as well. There is some American presence in Israel, just given the sheer amount of American weaponry and equipment in Israel that gets sold and given to Israel every year. You do have American support for that. And we have seen, especially since Hamas's attacks, we've seen increased coordination and collaboration, at least from the reporting we're hearing, what the Defense Department of the United States is saying, between Israel and the United States. But Kamala Harris does make the point there will be no boots on the ground, as they say, just like we've heard in Ukraine, right? Full support for Ukraine, just like full support for Israel, but no direct intervention. Nonetheless, the U.S., of course, maintains a massive military presence all around the world, especially in the Middle East, to defend what it sees as its interests, especially vis-a-vis Iran, right? We saw those strikes in Syria against targets from Iranian-backed groups. This was, as they said, in response to attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq. So it's a very delicate balance to, as the White House has said, deterrence without exacerbating or widening the conflict.
But Wliiam, don't these instances also show that the U.S. is itself a target from Iranian proxies? And if so, is there a danger, for instance, that the U.S. enters into a direct conflict with Iran?
Right. That danger is always there. And of course, the United States has a long history of some very bloody attacks. You know, if you think about Lebanon, for example, in the 1980s, the U.S. personnel that came under attack there. So the U.S. is certainly no stranger to being directly attacked by Iran proxies and by other opponents in the region to the United States. Right now, what we're seeing is, as I said, the United States wants to defend its interests, wants to send a message to Iran and to its affiliated groups around the region, not to get involved, not to escalate. But at the same time, the U.S. doesn't want to escalate itself. I think the U.S., the last thing it wants to do, especially while it's trying to renegotiate a nuclear deal with Iran, is to have yet another major war in the Middle East. Remember, Joe Biden, by getting out of Afghanistan, wanted to get away from this whole region. He wanted to focus on China and on Russia and not get bogged down in the Middle East, as the United States did for the 20 years after 9/11, with very little positive effect and just devastating consequences for the region and no real security gains for the United States. And I think that's what the Biden administration is looking at, trying to look at that recent history and not go down that road again, while at the same time, as the United States needs to defend its interests, still showing that it has the assets to do so without further antagonization.
But the question is also, how far will the U.S. actually go when it comes to supporting Israel militarily? I mean, what does that consist of, that support?
Right. I mean, the U.S. already sends the most amount of foreign aid, and most of it is military aid, to Israel than any other country in the world. It has now, since the existence of Israel, has sent billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of mostly military aid to Israel. So that partnership, that support for Israel, especially its defense, is already there. We've already seen, promises and actually deliveries of new munitions, especially when it comes to the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome, which Israel is famous for, this missile defense system that is highly effective against Hamas rocket attacks, is actually a U.S. weapon system, right? This was developed by Raytheon, by Lockheed Martin, major American military contractors. And so there's been promises to send more to Israel. But we have to remember, the U.S. is also trying to supply Ukraine, is trying to supply Taiwan, and we are officially, anyway, in a peacetime production situation, right? We are not like in a World War II situation where the entire economy has been turned over to producing to fight a war. So there are supply chain issues, right? Just Ukraine alone, the United States and its European allies have had trouble getting the weapons and the ammunition that Ukraine has asked for and has been promised to actually get it into the field. So whether they can be better or faster, there are just certain physical constraints that the United States faces in now keeping up its renewed commitments to Israel, whether it's missile defense, and other kinds of major weapon systems that Israel has asked for or may ask for, especially ammunition for its airplanes, because this has primarily been an air war thus far.
Wliiam, we've also heard in the past few weeks talk of a multi-front war that Israel could be facing. And depending on whom you speak to, the fronts either expand or shrink, but in any case, they remain multi-front. Some people talk about Hezbollah in addition to the West Bank, and then Israel facing internal security threats. I mean, the question that I was basically sort of arriving at is, depending on how Israel fares in affairs in a potential multi-front war, is there a possibility that the U.S. has to actually put boots on the ground and actually fight for Israel?
This is a big question, a very theoretical question for now, at least. Of course, Israel's existence is not in question. Hamas and Hezbollah, while they can strike with very heinous means at Israel, they, of course, do not threaten the very existence of Israel. Nonetheless, that question is a valid one because it's something that a country like the United States faces. What does it really mean when we say we stand up for Israel's defense? We stand up for its existence. We will make sure that it continues to exist. What does that really mean? And we see that not only in the case of Israel, we see in the case of U.S. commitments to Taiwan, U.S. commitments to Ukraine. How far will the United States really go to make to back its words with deeds? That is something we're very far from. Israel does have experience with fighting multi-front wars. We saw that in 1967. We saw that in 1973. In 1973, which was the gravest threat to Israel's continued existence as a state, the United States did get very close to actually not maybe putting boots on the ground, but very intense military support for Israel in those first days of the surprise attack against Israel on multiple fronts, when Israel really was facing quite an existential crisis. That is not what we're facing right now, but the point remains. What if the northern front from Lebanon, from Hezbollah, becomes active? What if Iran does want to escalate? These are the questions that Israel faces, and I think a major headache for the United States, which, as I said earlier, has many competing interests in the region. And while Israel might be a first among equals, it is not the only interest, by far, not the only interest in the region.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks very much, Wliiam, for bringing all that context to us. Wliiam Glucroft, thank you. And that's it for now. There's continuing updates on the Israel-Hamas war on our website. I'm Biresh Banerjee in Berlin. Thanks so much for watching.